the key factor was self-awareness. Okay. Now, just to be very, very clear, I don't believe that chronic fatigue syndrome or ME or long COVID, all these modern conditions, I don't believe that they are in the mind. Yeah, they are real physical illnesses. But at the same time, we have influence over our brain on just the subtle periphery of consciousness. So this isn't something we're generally aware of. But that was really the process, is recognizing that conditioning as an idea is something that we all regularly experience. Yeah, so conditioning is the idea that our brain is constantly learning new things. So if we learn to drive a car, on our first driving lesson, we will have to manually move the steering wheel and press the gas and move the gear shift and try and figure it all out. But then after 10, 15 lessons, it becomes automated in the brain. And in a similar way, I understood that when it comes to physiological reactions to our environment, the brain can sometimes get trained, conditioned. It learns something as a response to a virus or bacteria, but then gets stuck in that learned response. And just like learning to drive a car, you then have to unlearn that response.
Welcome to the MindHealth360 Show. I'm Kirkland Newman, and if you, your loved ones, or clients suffer from mental health issues such as depression, anxiety, insomnia, poor memory, poor attention, mood swings, exhaustion, etc., I interview the leading integrative mental health practitioners from around the world to help you understand the root causes of these symptoms, many of which may surprise you and suggest solutions to help you heal. If you like this interview, please do subscribe and forward to others who might find it helpful. If you want further information, please go to www.mindhealth360.com or find us on social media. Welcome, Ashok Gupta, to the MindHealth360 program. I'm so excited to have you here because for personal reasons, I myself have used your program. It was advised to me by Dr. Neil Nathan when I was suffering from mold toxicity and a lot of nervous system dysregulation. He said, you must try this amazing program called the Gupta Program to sort of retrain your brain. I had no idea what this was. I'd sort of heard about it, but I actually did it myself, and it was so helpful for me in terms of my neurological symptoms and my anxiety and these constant sort of muscle twitching, fasciculations, tremors that I was getting due to this mold exposure. So I'm thrilled to have you on the show, and I just want to thank you for everything that you've done for so many people. And, you know, we're in for a treat. So before starting, I just wanted to give your introduction, which is that you're an internationally renowned speaker, filmmaker, and health practitioner who have dedicated your life to supporting people through chronic illness and to achieving their potential. You yourself suffered from ME, or chronic fatigue syndrome, around 25 years ago when you were studying at Cambridge University. And through neurological research that you conducted, you managed to get yourself 100% better. You then set up a clinic to treat others and then published the well-known recovery program, as we were saying, known as the Gupta Program, in 2007. You've now published several medical papers, and you're continually researching these conditions. So you have created a truly groundbreaking program to help people. Tell us a little bit about your story, how you got here, and what this program is.
Well, yes, thank you, Kiki, for that wonderful introduction. Very honored to be here on your podcast. So yeah, I guess like most of us who are involved in this industry, we've come from our own pain to purpose, as they often call it. And so my journey started in the mid to late 90s. So I was an undergrad at Cambridge and was studying and kind of burning the candle at both ends.
What was
you do? I was studying economics, actually, as an undergrad there. And I got some kind of mysterious virus, and I didn't think much of it. And the virus seemed to go away, but my health seemed to steadily decline. And I got worse and worse and worse, to the point at which I couldn't read the words on a textbook. I had no energy. And I describe it like my worst day of flu times 5. So we all know what it feels like when you have flu. You're completely wiped out. You have no energy. You can't think. Now imagine that times 5 continuously. That's what I describe it like. And for a young man, it was like a brick wall in front of me. And I would go from doctor to doctor, and they would say, we don't know what you have. We don't know what to call it. We have no diagnostic test for it. By the way, you might have this forever. goodbye. And for me, that was just a complete brick wall. And in my worst moments, I had to crawl to the bathroom. I couldn't go out. I couldn't do anything. And like I'd been precipitated into a 100-year-old man. I mean, it was crazy. And that started my lifelong quest. I mean, in my worst moments, I was almost suicidal. And I made an agreement with the universe, a contract. And I said, if I can just get myself 30% better, 60% better, ideally 100% better, I will dedicate the rest of my life to helping others with these conditions. Because I'd met hundreds of others who also had it, who weren't getting help and support. And I finally got diagnosed with ME, or chronic fatigue syndrome. But really, that's a diagnosis that doesn't mean much. It just means we don't know what else is causing it, so we're going to diagnose you with this. And in that moment, I went into a bookstore in Cambridge, and I was looking at the health section, trying to find something that could help me with my condition. And there's a little book that was just jutting out of the shelf, and I can't explain it. I can't explain why it called out to me. And I picked that book off the shelf, and the cover of it read, The Emotional Life of the Brain by Professor Joseph Ledoux, who at the time in the 90s was the foremost expert on neurological conditioning processes, PTSD, and he'd done lots of studies. And it just called to me. So I just read that book, and I was astounded by that book. And I thought, this is the secret to what may be happening in chronic illnesses. And he's only working with animals, rats, but I think this whole underlying hypothesis is completely applicable to lots of other conditions. And so I got together a hypothesis. I understood what caused the condition. And in an ad hoc way, I believe it was in the brain. And I retrained my brain, got myself 100% well, and then set up a clinic to treat others with chronic fatigue syndrome at that time. And also published my medical hypothesis online in 1999, and then in a medical journal in 2002. And that's been my journey. So since then, we then published the first neuroplasticity program, brain retraining program in 2007, which was a DVD program in those days. And have since then, we've published seven medical studies and treated thousands of patients. So that's really been my journey from my own pain to it creating my own purpose.
Amazing. What a great story. I mean, those are the most, often the wounded healer is the most effective healer, right? So that's beautiful. In terms of the actual process, so you had chronic fatigue or ME, which still is a slightly misunderstood concept, I think, in, there's in mainstream medicine. So tell us what you did in order to recover, and how long did it take? And, presumably, it must not have been a straight line, as we know recovery never is. But what was the process of you coming to this theory or this hypothesis, which then worked for you? How did this all work? And what were the sort of key factors in your healing?
I think the key factor was self-awareness. Okay. Now, just to be very, very clear, I don't believe that chronic fatigue syndrome or ME or long COVID, all these modern conditions, I don't believe that they are in the mind. Yeah, they are real physical illnesses. But at the same time, we have influence over our brain on just the subtle periphery of consciousness. So this isn't something we're generally aware of. But that was really the process, is recognizing that conditioning as an idea is something that we all regularly experience. Yeah, so conditioning is the idea that our brain is constantly learning new things. So if we learn to drive a car, on our first driving lesson, we will have to manually move the steering wheel and press the gas and move the gear shift and try and figure it all out. But then after 10, 15 lessons, it becomes automated in the brain. And in a similar way, I understood that when it comes to physiological reactions to our environment, the brain can sometimes get trained, conditioned. It learns something as a response to a virus or bacteria, but then gets stuck in that learned response. And just like learning to drive a car, you then have to unlearn that response. You got to unlearn that. So some of us often, we've got bad habits when we're driving. And if you meet a driving instructor, they'll say, oh, you've learned that habit. That's really bad. You need to unlearn that habit. So in a similar way, I believe a lot of chronic illnesses are when the brain, in its protective response, learns to do something protective, overprotective, inappropriate. And we need to retrain the brain out of those responses. Actually, Kiki, to put that into context, it might help if I kind of go through the underlying hypothesis, and then it will put into context how I healed myself. So I always like to, so I always like to ask the biggest question of all: why are we here? Now, Kiki, I'm sure we can have an amazing conversation for the next hour on the meaning of life and the purpose of life. But let's focus on the science. We are here as human beings because this brain, this nervous system, this immune system has evolved over millions of years. So our system, our nervous system, immune system, prioritizes survival over well-being. And that is a secret to these conditions. So we've evolved from plant life to single-celled organisms to invertebrates, mammals, human beings. And we contain that lineage. So many people aren't aware that we contain a lot of the same DNA as that plant life and animal life. So we share 40% of the same DNA as a banana, which I think is a fascinating statistic. And so our systems are designed to survive, procreate, and pass on our genes to the next generation. So from a pure Darwinian scientific perspective, we're here to survive. And what's happened over the last few hundred years is we are now exposed to far more threats than we used to in human history. So now we live in a more toxic world in terms of food toxins, environmental toxins. We have more stress that is around us. We have more pressures because we're aware of all the bad stuff that happens on the planet. And then to top it off, we're now spending most of our times living in boxes, out of sunlight, staring at screens, which is increasing the threat detection levels in the brain. And so this is increasing how that threat system processes the world around us and keeping it on high alert continuously, which is why we're suffering more anxiety, more depression, and more of these types of chronic illnesses. And so the way some of these chronic illnesses start, so autoimmune diseases, chronic inflammatory diseases, pain conditions, I believe they start because of three factors. Number one is a genetic inheritance. So there may be something in our genes that makes us more prone to this. But secondly, and most importantly, it is psychosocial stresses, our environmental stresses, etc., that build up the toxic load in our brains and in our bodies that just requires one more thing to push us over the edge. And then along comes that third thing, a virus, bacteria, mold exposure, toxin. And what happens is normally our immune system, when it detects a threat, it goes into the on position, fights off that virus or toxin, and then goes back to the off position. Yep, so far so good. But if our system is compromised because of all the stress, and it's not just emotional stress, it's physical stress, as we said, we know from psychoneuroimmunology that our immune system's ability to fight is lowered. We are less immunoeffective. So now the immune system takes a lot longer to fight off that virus. And let's give the example of COVID, because we've all been through that. So imagine COVID comes along, and our system now takes a lot longer to fight off that COVID virus. And in that moment, going back to our first jigsaw piece, the brain prioritizes survival over well-being. So the brain thinks, you know what, I think I fought off the COVID virus, but what happens if it's still hiding in my system? Just to err on the side of caution, I'm going to continue that immune response, which is why we get that period of post-viral fatigue after a very intense virus or infection. But then what happens, and this is the key learning piece, the brain, erring on the side of caution, thinks that those symptoms in the body may be indicative of ongoing infection. So it detects those symptoms loop back to a hypersensitive, hypervigilant brain. The brain thinks, oh, I can feel these symptoms in my body. Maybe that means the virus is still present or the mold is still present. Let me stimulate my immune system and nervous system. So now the immune system and nervous system triggers, creating a sympathetic overload, immune dysfunction, inflammation, which causes all the physical symptoms in the body, which then loop back to the hypersensitive brain that thinks we're under threat and under danger. And around we go. And that's what then turns an acute illness into a chronic illness. And I give an analogy which can really help people understand this. And this is when people really get it. Because as you can imagine, it's taken years to put this together. It's a very complex hypothesis. So imagine you are queen of your kingdom. All right. You're Queen Kiki. And you have an army, which is your nervous system to protect the kingdom. And you have a navy, which is your immune system to protect the kingdom. And they protect against invading armies. So far, so good. Now imagine there's a drought in the kingdom. So now your kingdom is weaker, your army and navy is weaker. Now along comes a threat over the hill. That threat could be biological. So it could be a virus, bacteria, toxin. It could be some other kind of threat. Maybe it's overtraining. So as an example, athletes overtraining syndrome, people pushing their body too hard. Another threat could be a pain issue. So you may have had a car accident or some kind of localized pain. So these are all threats on the system. So the army comes over the hill and your army and navy now fight valiantly to get you back to health, to get rid of this invader. And it manages to fight off the incoming invader, but it's not sure if that incoming invader is hiding in the jungle or hiding in the forest. What happens if it's still there? So the army and navy generals are traumatized by the war. So they come to their weekly meeting with Queen Kiki and they say, Queen Kiki, we need all the resources of the kingdom. We need the water, the food, the metal, everything. Because if the kingdom falls, i.e. the organism dies, everything is lost. So everything should be prioritized to survive. So now that army and navy keep firing off their weapons of war, which is the inflammatory responses, the pain, all those types of responses to try and deal with the threat. But some of those arrows and cannonballs start falling back into the kingdom. And that's when we get the autoimmune effects, the inflammatory effects affecting the body. And on top of that, we also now find that opportunistic spies in the kingdom. So that's opportunistic infections, opportunistic viruses, Lyme, etc., HV6. They all start flourishing in the body, meaning there's now even more problems in the body, in the organism, in the kingdom. And this whole system now gets stuck in this response because the weaker and weaker the kingdom become, the more and more the army and navy keep firing off their weapons of war, trying to protect a weakened kingdom. And that's the new level of balance that the brain thinks is right, because it's just trying to protect you. And brain retraining is when they come to their weekly meeting with Queen Kiki and they say, Queen Kiki, we need all the resources. The kingdom is under threat. We're still in danger. And you say to them, my dear generals, you have done a wonderful job, but the war is over. You can stand down. And they won't believe you the first time or the second time or the third time. But the purpose of neuroplasticity is the power of repetition, creating new neural pathways in the brain to control the immune responses in the brain, to enable the brain to come back to balance. And the nearest analogy would be, let's say someone has a stroke and they lose control of an arm or a leg. They'll go to rehabilitation and they will have to reimagine those neural networks. So they'll have to imagine thinking about moving their arm, and they may be able to just move it slightly. But eventually, through repetition, creating new neural pathways, they regain control, maybe over speech or maybe a limb. And in a similar way, we figured out a way that we can regain control over an immune system and nervous system that is running riot. And that, in a nutshell, is the brain retraining.
That's fascinating. And so you mentioned autoimmune conditions and you mentioned mold and you mentioned long COVID. So just to recap, so essentially there is an initial, a real threat, right? Whether it's a virus or a bacteria or a mold or some sort of toxin or pathogen or an injury. These are physiological threats, right? They're chemical threats, they're immune threats, threats to the immune system. And as you pointed out, in fact, in one of your papers, you said, it used to be that we looked at the emotional threats, the effects of the emotional and psychological threats on the amygdala and the insula. But now your whole paradigm shift is saying that actually these physiological threats are considered just as threatening to the system as these emotional threats, as the psychological ones, right? So it used to be that sort of childhood trauma, being in an abusive relationship, these were considered threats to the system that would then generate a lot of anxiety and depression over time, right? And the sort of novelty, if I'm reading this correctly, of your whole system is basically that these chemical threats, these pathogenic threats, which are biological essentially, are interpreted by the body in a similar way. The body then launches its own immune and nervous system response to that, and then isn't able to then dial down its response, continues to respond, thereby creating more and more inflammation, fewer and fewer resources, more oxidation. And so it becomes this vicious circle over time. And so you have developed a training program to retrain the brain to say, actually, there is no longer a threat. You're safe, which is a big concept in psychological and emotional work is you have to create a sense of safety for the traumatized patient to recover. And so what you're doing is what a lot of, these pioneers in trauma therapy, whether it's Bessel van der Kolk or Stephen Porges, creating the sense of safety is just as important for physiological and biochemical threats as it is for psychological ones. And I think that's what's so amazing about this sort of what you've developed, is that it really does answer this and put to the forefront the fact that these chemical assaults and these pathogenic assaults, which we're all subject to, are just as threatening to the system as the psychological ones. Now, you mentioned autoimmune conditions, which fascinates me because these are all on the rise, right? And so you think that basically, in your theory, autoimmune conditions are an overactive nervous and immune system, which then can be retrained. Is that correct?
Yes. And just to take a step back to what you've just described, you've got it absolutely in that nutshell. And if I can just bring up a slide, which I think will help people put this into context if people are watching this versus listening to it. This slide really helps people to understand where these two brain structures are that we focus on. We call it amygdala and insula retraining. That traditionally those structures may have been involved in psychological research. And when you go to a hospital, there'll be a separate immunology department, a separate psychology department, a separate physiology department. But the brain doesn't differentiate between threats. It simply says, what is the package of emotional, physical, and biological threats that I'm facing? And what is the holistic package of responses that I then enact to create balance and create survival? And that is the key thing. And so every emotional response has a physiological aspect. Every physiological response has an emotional aspect. And that is key. And the amygdala is generally our threat detection kind of vessel, as it were, in the brain. And the insula is the kind of self-preservation part of the brain, which looks at all the incoming data, all the incoming processes in the body, and then looks to create balance through the immune system and nervous system. Yeah? So these kind of structures work together. And in the case of autoimmune threats and autoimmune conditions, I think it's a similar situation. And I can actually describe it in this diagram. We talked about, first of all, the different precipitating factors, such as a genetic predisposition, stress at number 2, and that assault at number 3, which then can cause this type of vicious cycle, where the brain gets conditioned at number 4, creating a chronic sympathetic arousal and immune dysfunction at number 5.
Now,
Which
we
creates
can't see this, by the way. Can you, yes, perfect. That's it. Yes. So repeat.
you can see it now.
Yeah.
Okay, so when I put it into full screen, you can't see that.
No, I can see it now, though.
Oh, you can see it now. Okay. Great. So I was just saying, so in this diagram, we have those 3 factors at the top we talked about. So genetic factors, psychosocial factors, and environmental factors, and then that acute physical assault. Then at number 4, we get conditioning in the brain. The brain learns to over-respond at number 4, creating the symptoms at number 6 via number 5, which is overstimulation of the sympathetic nervous system, the immune system, and abnormalities in the hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal axis, and oxidative stress. And that then causes symptoms at number 6 and secondary illness cycle. So we then get latent virus reactivation, mitochondrial dysfunction, allergies and sensitivities, which all contribute then to the issues at number 6. We also get compromised detoxification and dysbiosis in the gut and all the gut issues that come with it, which all contribute to number 6. Those symptoms loop back at number 8 to a chronically sensitized brain, which then at number 9, the brain overstimulates the immune system and nervous system, and around we go in this vicious cycle. And in this vicious cycle, it's a similar process then for autoimmune conditions. And so we're having a lot of success with MS, as an example, where we're actually getting patients telling us that they are reversing their MS. They're actually improving their condition. Because in a similar way, we believe that MS can be as a result of EBV, as Epstein-Barr virus as an example, where the brain triggers an immune response to EBV, and it then believes that attacking certain neurons in the spinal cord are representative of EBV. For whatever reason, it mistakes that, creates this chronic sympathetic response and immune reactivation, attacking our own cells, creating those symptoms and creating even more of a vicious cycle. And we're actually doing a study right now on MS, and we're looking to see whether we can improve the symptomatology of people with MS as well. And so the application of this is very broad, because most modern conditions, and we've estimated 70% of the things that you go to see a doctor for, are actually where your own nervous system and immune system is overreacting. So if you think of skin disorders, you think of anxiety, depression, you think of pain, you think of post-viral syndromes, you think of fatigue, all of these conditions we believe are overreactions of the immune system and nervous system. And if we could find the right key to the right lock, if we could unlock and retrain the brain that this is an inappropriate response, it could be so exciting. We could heal a whole host of different inflammatory diseases. And that's the promise of neuroplasticity.
It's fascinating. I mean, when you mentioned depression and anxiety as being sort of an overreaction, so what it makes me think of is a maladaptive response, which we know, for instance, trauma, PTSD is a maladaptive response. It's an adaptive response if you consider the initial threat, but it's a maladaptive response if you look at it over time, where there's a discrepancy between when the response is happening and when the original insult happened, right? So whether it's a trauma or whether it's a biological insult, a virus or bacteria, there's a maladaptive response. In the beginning it's a timing thing, essentially. So in the beginning you were saying, it's an adaptive response. It's an absolutely appropriate response for the immune system and the nervous system to react to this, but it becomes maladaptive as it happens inappropriately. Now, so you're saying that the causes of that maladaptive response are threefold. They're genetic, they're the result of chronic stress or an acute stressor at that time. And then the third thing, remind me of that on the one.
The physical assault. So that's it. So number 1 is genetic. Number 2 is psychosocial and how much historical cumulative exposure you've had to threats. And then the third one is that acute threat that comes along. And as you say, really what happens is the brain gets stuck in time. So just like trauma, we have subpersonalities that get stuck in time. In a similar way, the immune system and nervous system gets stuck at the time of the original sensitizing events and no longer can inhibit those responses and calm them down. And Kiki, what I love about what you said, and you've been brilliant at actually summarizing what I'm talking about, so I think you really get this, is we notice, and studies have shown, that people who have a background of trauma are twice as likely to get chronic conditions than people who don't have trauma. And we figured out now why that might be, because of the amygdala and insula. So we know that the factory setting of the amygdala, which essentially represents how threatening it sees the world around us, is set due to a number of different factors. So the first factor is gestation. How stressed was your mother whilst you were in the womb? The second factor is the birth experience itself. So even how traumatic being born was. The third and most important is the first 5 years of life. So how your parents treated you, the sense of feeling loved, supported, or neglected in the first 5 to 10 years of life. They then create the factory setting of the amygdala and also influence the insula as well. And that then means that it makes the brain more prone in later life to learning these conditioning effects, which then make us more prone to the anxiety and depression because the brain is now primed to detect threats. So naturally, it's going to be primed to over-detect emotional threats, which then causes the anxiety and depression, but then be more primed to detect physiological threats. And that's where the difference in the work that we're doing is that, and some of the treatments are different. So the way we treat trauma and the way that we treat these physiological conditions is actually different, but has the underlying similar hypothesis. And so, yes, we are essentially retraining a historical legacy of people's amygdalas and insulas and how they are easily maladaptive in the modern world.
So interesting. And so, when you talk about, so it's saliency, essentially, it's like, picking up things. I'm just thinking of a sort of more concrete example, but say, I'll use mine. I have fasciculations, muscle fasciculations, which are quite intense and go on for a long time in all the different muscles in my body. That started with mold exposure combined with a period of very high stress and went on for about 6 months before it was diagnosed as mold exposure. And during those 6 months, I was convinced that this was the beginnings of a neurodegenerative disease, whether it was MS or ALS or Parkinson's. And that was terrifying. And then I got rid of the mold in my home. I chelated and, I did binders and got rid of most of the mold in my body. But I was still having, and I got about 70% better, but I find it very hard to shift that last 30%. And I think part of the problem, and your program has helped me so much, is that saliency of I'm so attuned and hypervigilant to the slightest symptom that then it creates, I have these muscle twitches especially when I get into a moldy area. And, then my response is, oh, well, maybe it is ALS, or maybe, that's lurking, or maybe the mold could have caused that. And so it's that saliency, like under normal circumstances, I probably wouldn't even notice the twitching, but I'm so attuned to noticing this muscle twitching. Is that what you mean by, that sort of hypervigilance and the vicious circle that then has to be retrained? And I guess my question to you is, those twitches, are they things that have been there and I just haven't noticed them? Or are they getting worse because maybe I've come into a moldy area? Or am I more hypersensitized to mold and therefore I'll react more? I mean, it may be a tough question to answer, but I'm just curious.
Oh, we have a hypothesis on that for sure. And we treat hundreds of mold patients. What happens is the brain is not perfect in its responses. It just learns what's appropriate at that particular time. So when we go into a moldy environment and we have that first exposure, it may well be that was an overwhelmingly threatening environment in terms of the exposure of mold, right? And that would be objectively, for any person, it would be too much mold. So the brain then learns, this is a moldy environment, quick, get out of here. And the brain is very efficient. So it creates what we call a condition response where now, so before 100% exposure would create 100% response. But in the future, it thinks, well, if I only have 5% exposure or 10% of the original pathogen, I must still defend. Do you see? So that can then mean you go into perfectly normal environments that the average person wouldn't detect anything, but your brain is more attuned and hypervigilant to that and then will over-respond. Now, in terms of the muscle twitching, the brain, at the point of time at which it was defending itself in the initial sensitizing event, so when you first had mold, it may have twitched at that time because it felt that was an appropriate response, for whatever reason. And we know that when the nervous system is highly tense, we can get muscle twitching. Yeah, and of course there are things like trauma release experience, releasing where we're vibrating the body, we're vibrating certain muscles to be able to release tightness or stiffness from our nervous system. And so in a similar way, the twitching is an attempt from the nervous system to almost kind of resolve where the muscle fibers have become tense, and it needs to then be able to get rid of lactic acid and kind of calm and twitch those muscles back to an off position. So sometimes we get that kind of muscle twitching. And there can be other that's just one mechanism, that many different mechanisms. But if your brain thought that was the right thing to do at the first time, then any future exposures, that muscle twitching may happen again. whether or not it will actually help you with mold exposure. And a second thing that's so important with this, people often say, oh, but Ashok, you can't heal from mold without doing the binders and doing the detoxification, all these good things. And I encourage people to do all of those things anyway, if they are beneficial. So we aren't dogmatic. But at the same time, we have to recognize that our body is its own best detoxifier. And what happens when we get stuck into these chronic sympathetic immune states, what happens is it's disruptive to the gut microbiome, and also it switches off our natural detoxification systems. So then we get accumulation of heavy metals, accumulation of mycotoxins, accumulation of all kinds of things, opportunistic infections. So then the functional medicine doctor or integrative doctor will say, look, we've done your labs and this is all completely wrong. You can't get better unless we fix all of those things. But what they're not bearing in mind here is, and this is what we see in our clients, if we get the immune system and nervous system into the optimal healing state, our bodies can naturally detoxify and get back to a healthy state. So we have many patients who do the binders and do all the good supplements, and that's great. And they do that in combination with brain retraining. But we also have patients who've done all of those processes and are still incredibly sick, do brain retraining, and then get better without those supports. So it's just interesting that it's not a X plus Y equals Z. It's a more complex picture. And, we encourage people to do as many things as possible to kind of create a cumulative, integrative and a holistic approach to healing.
I love what you say, because I think it's so important that we're empowered, to be able to self-heal in some ways, and our bodies have the power to heal. But I would like to challenge you a little bit by saying that, okay, yes, I agree that our bodies are designed to heal if you optimize the nervous system and the immune system. But there are a few things. First of all, there are genetic SNPs that certain people have that make detoxification slightly more challenging and that challenge the immune system more. And then things like, your lifestyle, the nutrition that you use. And I think that's back to your 1, 2, 3. It's back to your genetics combined with the sort of stress that you're, surrounded by, and then the trigger. But say you're eating a crappy diet, and you're in an environment which, and you have genetic SNPs that make it harder to detoxify, and you're stressed, you can do, well, I mean, the stress, I guess, is a slightly separate issue, but if you do your training program, it'll be a lot more challenging to heal for somebody like that who's eating badly and who has bad genetic SNPs to detoxify and to regulate their immune system. But you think it's still doable, it might just be harder?
So Kiki, absolutely, we have a holistic approach. So we do look at diet and supplements, but not from a specific perspective of each client, but at a general level. So we say to patients, look, you have a bucket of stress that your system can handle. And if you're putting into that bucket lots of environmental triggers, so if you've got lots of, toxic chemicals in your environment, you're using certain cleaning products, that's adding to your bucket. If you're eating artificial processed foods, foods which aren't organic, that's also adding something to your bucket. So we recommend what we call the anti-inflammatory diet. So is a fresh whole food type of diet that's reducing as many toxins as possible, also taking all the kinds of supplements that we know are anti-inflammatory and support the immune and nervous system. And we look at sleep. So how can we deepen and strengthen our sleep? Because actually sleep is a huge part of inflammation. And the overstimulation of the nervous system interrupts sleep. And there's even a radical idea in the Gupta program, which is everything that we are doing ultimately is to deepen the circadian rhythms so your brain and your body naturally detoxify at night, so that the health and repair happens and your parasympathetic nervous system kicks in. So sleep is an absolute important component. So really, we say there are 4 components to health. The first is mind. Then there's energizing the body. So that's physical activity, exercise, stretching. N is for nighttime. So that's your sleep. And D is for diet. So we call it the MEND protocol. So you're absolutely right. In the Gupta program, we definitely emphasize the importance of the holistic approach. And we also feel that the brain part of it, for a lot of patients, not all, is the most important piece. And if you get that piece right, then it becomes a lot easier for the other things to fit into place and support healing. And that's why we have a lot of people, even like Dr. Neil Nathan, other practitioners, for some patients, they'll say, we can't touch you because you're just too sensitive. We need you to calm your nervous system down, regulate it before we'll even try binders and supplements or medications, because your system's just overreacting to everything.
Yeah, and that's so interesting because, in fact, Neil has done a lot of work on the sensitive patient. And, I'm also interested in the cell danger response by Robert Navio, which is, once your cells are primed to be in this sort of danger response, it's very hard for them to wind back down. And so I presume that your program is a good way of resetting the cellular response so that it's not in that state of danger. Have you looked at this in the context of Robert Navio's work?
Oh, absolutely. I'm aware of Robin Avio's work, and I think it's fantastic. I think my only caution here is that in medicine, we have this history of becoming reductionist in mainstream medicine. So a lot of us have moved to functional and integrative medicine because we wanted to be more holistic. And sometimes we can, once again, at the biochemical level, at the minutest level, we can believe that that's where the intelligence is and that's where the programming is. And what I would say is that, yes, the mitochondria are responding to a whole host of signaling at a localized level. And whether you call this a hypothesis at this stage, all of that information gets channeled back to the central nervous system and the head of the central nervous system, which is the brain, and specifically the amygdala, the insula, other parts of the brain, that where the intelligence lies to say, are we still under threat? What do we need to tell the organs and cells to do now? You see? And so I think it's great that we have the self-danger response hypothesis and not even a hypothesis, all the great results that we see from that understanding. But ultimately, I still believe that regulating the nervous system and the immune system from the top down has a really big impact on that cell danger response. And Kiki, I want to share with you some studies which really have informed my work and to me are mind-blowing. So to demonstrate this, most of us have thought about the immune system as being quite peripheral, that, you cut your leg, the immune system at a localized level recognizes what's going on and is able to heal that at a localized level. And there's some kind of information flows that travel around the body, but we don't really fully understand it. Right? Now, there have been some amazing studies done by Dr. Paquero Lopez on rats. And what they do is they take rats and they give them an immunosuppressant combined with sweet water. And of course, naturally, the immune system is suppressed. And they repeat that 5 times. Then what they're able to do is just give the rats sweet water without the immunosuppressant. And guess what happens? The rat's immune system is compromised. The idea of conditioning in the brain. And when they then dissect the brains of these rats, they recognize that it's caused by the amygdala and stored in the insula part of the brain, which I find completely fascinating. Yeah. And so therefore we know that peripheral immune responses have a centralized storage in the insula. And then the groundbreaking work of Dr. Assia Rolls, which is incredible. She's the first person on the planet to demonstrate this. They took rats and they gave them an irritant in their guts, which created inflammatory bowel disease in the rats. All right. Which we would see, once again, as a localized condition. You've got an irritant in your gut. The gut recognizes it. It creates inflammatory bowel disease. And they measured the electrical signature in the insular part of the brain. Okay. Then they brought these rats back to baseline. Then they re-triggered just the same electrical signature in the insular part of the brain. And guess what? They recreated exactly the same inflammatory bowel disease in the guts of these rats. Okay?
Wow.
Now, that is, people it's very, just taking a step back, that is such an incredible idea that could it be that all of our localized immune responses, as intelligent as they are, all of that information gets fed back via the vagus nerve and other afferent kind of patterns and modalities back to the brain, back to the insula, getting stored in anticipation of the next threat, which makes sense because the brain is efficient. It helps us survive. And if that is the case, when the brain makes mistakes, especially when we're emotionally stressed, which impacts on the insula and amygdala, the brain then may cause excessive conditioning effects in the insular part of the brain to mold, to Lyme, to viruses, bacteria, etc. That gets stored in the insula and keeps then getting re-triggered in combination with the amygdala. causing all the downstream impacts and effects, disrupting the gut, causing this inflammation. And we can do some, don't get me wrong, fantastic work at the downstream level in terms of supplements, diet, binders, enzymes, all great stuff. But ultimately, we are compensating for what the brain is doing, which is overstimulation. But if we could do both of those things, work at the downstream level, but also go upstream to the master gland, the insula, retrain the brain that we are no longer in danger, switch down and dampen down those immune responses, we're going to accelerate healing. And that's what we're seeing time and time again in these chronic conditions.
It's fascinating. I mean, I have so many questions. I think the first one is, so you're talking about sort of upstream and downstream. So downstream being the body and the organs and how to support those in a biochemical way. And then upstream, which is essentially the work that you do to retrain the brain, the neuroplasticity. What about the fact that we know that 80% of vagal, nerves are essentially afferent? No, efferent or afferent? I always get this confused. They go from the organs to the brain and not the other way around, right? That's afferent, right?
Yes, afferent, yeah.
And so a lot of the therapies now that we're looking at and that have proven to be a lot more effective are somatic therapies. So they're therapies that work with the body, with cellular memory, whether it's, EMDR, somatic experience, psychomotor, sensory motor processing, and sensory motor psychotherapy. And so those aren't, it's not looking at the biochemistry and supporting the organs through chemicals, or by, supplements, etc. It's really trying to reprogram the nervous system from the body up. So looking at cellular memory, looking at, your sort of nervous system from a somatic perspective. So given that so much of the information is going from the bottom up to the brain, while I agree that you need a two-pronged approach, we're moving away in therapy from the sort of more cognitive behavioral therapy, which I guess uses more the prefrontal cortex, whereas your program is more based in the limbic system. Is that the big difference? Because, in the overview of therapy, we are moving away from the more cognitive types of therapies, because we're saying actually things like positive thinking, CBT, they actually don't work when it comes to trauma, which is stored in the body, or stressors that are stored in the body. So we need to work with the body and do somatic therapies in order to heal. And so I think the difference, if I'm hearing this correctly and understanding it, is that your therapies essentially approach a different part of the brain, which is more the emotional part rather than the rational cognitive part. And therefore, it's almost like your system acts like a bridge between the body and the prefrontal cortex, the more cognitive parts of the brain. Would you say that's sort of on the right path?
So we are talking about a very integrated system. And so the nervous system, as you say, the brain may be the head of the nervous system, but it is essentially feeding into every organ, every cell of the body in terms of an instructional perspective, top down and bottom up in terms of information flows and instructional flows as well. There's both of those types. And first of all, in our program, we do use what we call somatic retraining. So we are working with the body and the bodily awareness. But ultimately, if we want to really go deeper into the science of this, what are we truly working with? We are working with consciousness, actually. Yeah. Now, this might go into more woo-woo territory. But ultimately, even when we're using somatic work, even when we're doing EMDR, even when we are, let's say, tuning into or somatic experiencing or tuning into our muscles or ultimately, we are retraining consciousness. And that consciousness uses the nervous system as its essentially processing system. Just like a piece of software is essentially a bunch of zeros and ones, but it uses the hardware of your computer to actually then create physical processes that can be measured. But can you actually measure a piece of software? Very difficult to. So in a similar way, in our program, we start off with calming and regulating the nervous system through breath work, through meditation, through somatic work. So really allowing a patient to tune into their bodies. because a lot of these patients, because they have a background of trauma, they've often dissociated from their physical bodies. And in a similar way, they are dissociating from their physical symptoms. And in dissociating from their physical symptoms, they're training their amygdala and insula that the body is in danger. So that resistance is a danger response. So just like in trauma therapy, we are enabling a patient to reacquaint themselves with their body and feel safer in their physical body. So that's where there are certain parallels. Now, at the same time, what's unique about what we're doing is the brain in this hyperactive, hyperdefensive state is throwing up a whole bunch of emergency responses. And in this type of retraining, if we don't interrupt those type of emergency responses, the brain assumes that those emergency responses are correct. Right? And the example being, let's say you have a fear of public speaking, which is the biggest fear on the planet. More people fear public speaking than death, apparently. And so if you're about to stand up in front of a huge audience and actually talk and you're extremely nervous, your brain is being bombarded by a whole bunch of danger signals. Yeah. Now, of course, you can approach that in a somatic way. That's one way of dealing with that. And at the same time, if you don't interrupt those patterns through trying to calm the brain down, giving yourself positive talk, telling yourself it's going to be okay, I'll be able to do this, you're going to get overwhelmed with all of that signaling, with that crazy levels of signaling, which could overwhelm the insula and amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. So a lot of the retraining there is that type of retraining. So we think it's not about moving away from one type of therapy to the other. It's actually the right tool for the right job. So we think integrating somatic approaches and cognitive approaches and general nervous system regulation responses, the culmination of those three aspects are most powerful. And the sum is great. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And therefore, once again, in therapy, we have this idea of, well, that didn't work on its own, so now we're going to go and do this. Actually, it's all of them working together, which I find most powerful. And that's what we do in the Gupta program. Somatic, more kind of cognitive, and then more general nervous system regulation. When you do those together, you train the brain that we are in safety, we are no longer in the presence of threat, and it can ramp down those responses. And secondly, what I'll also say is, in a lot of therapy circles, neurological circles, we're talking about the number of nerves that send signals one way versus the other. Yeah, that is one part of the equation. The second part of the equation is the strength of that signaling. So just because there's more nerves going from the gut and the body up to the brain does not mean logically that there is therefore more control in that particular pathway. It simply means that, of course, there's more organs in the body, so there's more information that needs to flow back to the central organ up here. But that in no way discounts the fact that the brain still might be the ultimate sentinel of what the body does, and therefore the strength of its signaling that way down could actually be more important in the overall process. So once again, there are these principles which come out, but they don't lead to that logic that therefore the body is more important than the brain. They are one organism working together to create homeostasis and survival. Yeah, even the top-down, bottom-up approach is creating duality. It's one organism ensuring survival, and how do we influence all those different aspects to create a sense of safety?
It really rejoins Stephen Porges' work about safety being really the bedrock of healing, and that, you cannot heal either physically or mentally unless you feel safe. And it's just that simple. And so essentially your program, if I'm not mistaken, really helps people feel safe in order to then enable their healing.
I think go ahead.
No, yeah.
And I think that is an important principle. And in trauma healing, the way that is done is slightly different to the way it's done in when there's a threat from a physical thing. Because what's so interesting is that when it comes to trauma, we have a historical memory of a threat, and then there are occasional things in our environment that may re-trigger us. But with physiological threats, what's unique is that threat that the brain has become conditioned to is with us 24 hours a day. We can't get away from it. So the intensity and the frequency of that threat is continuous, which is why these chronic illnesses are so debilitating and so terrible, because you can never get away from it. So therefore, there's no space, there's no window to give you a bit of space from what the threat. It's continuous, and that's why retraining has to be even more consistent and repetitive in order to bring the safety back.
I mean, I would argue that even in the emotional, psychological aspects, that threat is always with you, because essentially what you're saying is that threat is really, it's, a physiological response in your brain, essentially. And I would say that even, if you have trauma, one of the problems is that you're living in this perpetual feeling that you are still in that state of threat, that the threat is real, it's still there, even though it's not. Would you say so when you say that threat is always there, it's not that the mold spore or that the pathogen is actually there. It's that you're responding as if it's there. Is that correct?
Yes. And I totally agree with you that in terms of trauma, your brain is perceiving that you are under a generalized threat from your environment. What I'm getting at here is, in the case of mold, yes, it's occasional. But if the brain is hypersensitive to symptoms in the body, and it detects symptoms in the body as representative of ongoing infection, of ongoing threat, then you are under siege 24 hours a day, every second, every moment, because you are being bombarded with signals of how your physical body is feeling, which not always with trauma. I'm not trying to compare them to trauma, but with trauma, you're not always necessarily being bombarded 24 hours a day by the continual threat, by the continual trigger. Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Now, in terms of so what sort of complex chronic illnesses does your system work particularly well with? And one that I'm thinking about that really is very far from what we're discussing. We're discussing more neurological and mental health issues and autoimmune conditions. But what about something like cancer? What is the relationship between cancer and your sort of theory of how would you explain, or would you explain, cancer in the context of your theory?
Yeah, very interesting. So we have a new paper that's coming out, which puts our entire hypothesis together step by step and looking at explaining illness on the planet through these two brain structures. So, yeah, and making the connection. Of course, we want to be careful ourselves that we aren't as reductionist as we are trying to oppose reductionism. But the way we look at cancer and a lot of these chronic diseases is that when an organism is under threat, these threat detection, monitoring, and response systems are supposed to be occasional. Yeah? Now, if these threat detection systems and threat response systems, such as the immune system, become chronic, and we get chronic inflammation because we're in toxic environments, we're eating bad food, we're not sleeping well, etc., what that means is that the immune system is not efficient, because what it's doing is it's fighting an army over here and it's fighting a perceived threat over here, but your body has limited resources. So therefore, it's easier for your immune system to miss the cancer cells. This is the key. And therefore, that's why we know that chronic inflammation is a risk factor for chronic disease or longer-term chronic disease, because the immune system isn't working to its optimal level. So it misses when there is, the issues with cancer cells being formed initially, and it misses those. And the weaker the immune system is, the more those cancer cells can then obviously proliferate, and then it causes, a longer-term issue. And then once someone is diagnosed with cancer, and this is what we want to work with our program, what can then happen is the overwhelming fear, the existential threat that then occurs at that point can worsen the effectiveness of the immune system and nervous system. And many cancer patients talk about that actually they just feel, once again, it's a almost traumatic response to the diagnosis itself. And so we've actually had quite a few cancer specialists who now are recommending our program to people with cancer to exactly do this, to reset their immune and nervous system responses so that they can strengthen their immune system to do the very effective work that it can do if it was put in the right state. So just like we use, when someone is diagnosed with cancer, We encourage them to have a healthy diet, to detoxify, and do all those good things to strengthen the immune system. Actually, the mind aspect of that is just as important, if not more important. That can we help people who are newly diagnosed to regulate? And that's not just from a place of brain retraining. That's also at a deeper existential level, at a spiritual level. Many people talk about cancer being a spiritual journey, and how can we help them to strengthen that sense of self, strengthen that sense of confidence and purpose in themselves, so they can have a better immune system, stronger immune system.
So interesting. And so back to all the different conditions that your approach can help. I mean, it sounds to me as if there's no limit to the number of conditions. I mean, your approach can strengthen the immune system and really be effective with every single health condition out there, because what you're doing is you're optimizing the body and the mind and the system to heal itself, and that can be applied to any sort of condition. But are there any conditions that you think it works particularly well with, or that you have particularly good research on, or that you think, for people listening, oh, I've got that, so this could really help?
Well, we have now conducted 6 clinical studies. So 4 of them are randomized controlled trials, and 2 of them are clinical audits. And to help answer that question, if I can just share one of the studies that we've done on 16 different conditions. So hopefully you can see this. So this was just published earlier this year. This was an independent clinical audit run by a company that looked at our patients and their percentage improvement after 12 weeks of using the Gupta program. And this is the EQ5D visual analog score. And you can see there across the 16 conditions, the percentage improvement. And across 14 of these conditions, it was significant. 2 of them weren't significant, or they were very close to significance, which was CIRS and SIBO. But all of the rest of them were highly significant. And you can see ME and chronic fatigue syndrome, a 70% improvement in health and functioning after 3 months. Long COVID, 84% improvement. Mould, 67%. And anxiety, 68%. And it's remembering that this study was done before we had an app, before we had daily Zoom calls, and before we had a whole bunch of new things we're doing with patients, which is making the program even more effective. So we think if we conducted this study now, we would get much better results than even this. So this gives you a snapshot of some of the conditions that we are seeing really good results with.
And I'm curious about the SIRS results, because I'm very surprised by that, because, SIRS, which is chronic inflammatory response syndrome, I would imagine would be the sweet spot for what you're treating. So why do you think that the results weren't as good for the SIRS?
Well, I think what this is when people are reporting their particular condition, they're reporting this as their primary condition, that they what they would describe as being diagnosed with. But we know with a lot of these conditions, there's many crossovers. And so often people have fibromyalgia with mold. So have they got fibromyalgia with mold as a secondary condition, or mold with fibromyalgia as a secondary condition? So it's a very mixed picture here. And certainly with CIRS, I think that there are often, when people are diagnosed with that, they tend to be the more serious patients in terms of a deeper, more chronic inflammatory response. And I think that this is research that's ongoing. We want to understand ourselves what differentiates between how well someone does on our program versus not. What conditions are we better for versus not? And so it's an ongoing process. And at the moment, we're about to launch a study on mold illness to see if we can get even better results than this. But I think that we call ourselves a 6-month program. So in the initial 3 months are learning the tools and techniques and putting them into practice. But then the second 3 months are really consolidating it and not becoming complacent and making sure that the brain is retrained for the longer term. So yeah, I think it's an intriguing question, the differences between the results here.
And just to play devil's advocate, and don't get me wrong, I think your approach is fabulous. I've used it myself. I think it's been hugely, hugely helpful. And whenever I sort of have that anxiety about my symptoms, I always think of you in your program saying, stop. And, that's what comes up. But just to play devil's advocate, if somebody were to meditate and eat well and exercise and have a healthy lifestyle and try and minimize stress for 6 months, would that not come close to having the same effect as this program? Or do you think there comes a point where you reach a plateau and your program is necessary to really unlock full healing?
Right. So in our studies, we want to be as scientifically rigorous as possible. And that's why we're looking for funding, in fact, for larger scale studies. We always compare to a control group. And so the first thing is, in our program, we do incorporate, obviously, relaxation of the nervous system and good diet, healthy living. But most clients come to us having already been down those avenues. What's unique here is it's not enough to just overall calm the brain. There are specific neuronal responses, sometimes called cell assemblies in the brain, that are specific responses that need to be retrained. So as an example, if you're learning to drive a car, if you were super relaxed and ate a good diet, it's not really going to help you learn to drive the car. You'd still have to look at those specific nervous system responses and neural rewiring to create learning, new conditioning in the brain. So that's a kind of similar way. And if I can just share some of the results from some of our studies where we actually did exactly what you've described. We compared our program to a health and well-being program. So as an example, with fibromyalgia, this was an 8-week study. So this is quite a short study. We compared our program to a wellness program that included essentially relaxation type techniques, mindfulness type techniques. And we had a 40% or 37% reduction in fibro scores after 8 weeks, but 0% in the control, 50% improvement in health, halving of pain, halving of anxiety, halving of depression, but very small percentage changes in the control group. So this is to answer exactly that critique that people may have. And then hopefully you can see this next slide. We did a study on long COVID, which compared the Gupta program to a wellness program. And that wellness program had diet, supplements, relaxation, sleep, activity levels, and was structurally similar. And after 12 weeks, the Gupta program was 4 times more effective at reducing fatigue and exhaustion. So it's very rare in a clinical study you get a 400% comparison. Twice as effective at increasing levels of energy and close to 100% increase in energy levels. So that gives you a flavor of some of these types of studies, which are showing that it's not just a relaxation, it's not just good living, it's far more than that. It's getting at the root cause of what is causing the brain to be in this hyperactive state. And we've just done a study on older adults with cognitive decline, or certainly the beginning of dementia. And we've found that the Gupta program combined with exercise had these types of improvements in terms of working memory, sleep, and depressive symptoms and emotional regulations. That's just a recently published study as well. And finally, something I'd like to share with you, which is hot off the press. We're doing a study right now on long COVID patients. And people, once again, might have that critique that, well, what happens if this is just placebo or whatever? We can actually look at our program compared to a control. And looking at heart rate variability, in the active Gupta program group, we're seeing a doubling of HRV compared to a control group where there's actually a reduction in HRV, which is a representation of obviously how stimulated the nervous system is and how anxious we are. And in terms of CRP, which is C-reactive protein, which is a representation of inflammation in the body, we're seeing a halving of inflammation in the active Gupta program group, but an actual increase in inflammation in the control group, similar with autonomic symptoms. So I think what this is useful for is really not only giving us subjective data, but beginning now in clinical studies to give us objective data as well. And I just recently presented this data at Harvard, and it was very well received at one of the conferences there, and we're looking to see how we can get larger scale studies.
That's fascinating. Sorry, you froze there, and so I thought you'd stopped speaking. And so if we look at, your program, so wrapping up, what would you say for people who are new to your program, what are the sort of key tenets of your program? So you mentioned it's a 6 months program. What does it actually consist of? And what are the key tenets that you think really shift the needle?
So the program has 3 components, the 3 R's of the program. The first is when people first go into the program, they'll learn how to become aware of their stress response, their nervous system response, and how to regulate that response through numerous different tools. So we use breath work, we use body work, we use stretching, we use somatic work, and of course, meditation. And people pick and choose the techniques that they find work for them. Yep. So we aren't, once again, dogmatic. It's about what's useful for your nervous system to regulate it. Because if our nervous system is dysregulated, our brain is not neuroplastic. We can't retrain the brain if it's over-triggered. So that is the first port of call, is to loosen up the ground, as it were, so that we can dig a new channel. The second step is retraining the brain, and that's the unique part of the program. And that is training a patient to recognize when the immune system and nervous system is about to overstimulate or is overstimulated, and those threat responses that keep showering the brain with danger signals, and how to continually and repetitively retrain that, create new neural pathways that inform the brain that we aren't in the presence of the original pathogen. The war is over. They can stand down. And some of that incorporates the aspect of safety, but also emotional regulation. It incorporates imagination and visualization, self-coaching and self-talk through a unique recipe that is repeated again and again and again. Yep. So that's the second part. And the third part is what we call re-engaging with joy. That in life, even once we've retrained the brain, if we go back to the normal stress responses, we will just re-trigger some of those latent immunological responses. So we now need to learn about why our brain hyper-responds and how it over-responds, and learn to recognize our stress triggers and become calmer for the rest of our life. And that is how we learn to re-engage with our natural joy, our natural relaxation in the body, and train people for the rest of their lives. So it's not just getting well, but staying well. And that's the third component. And those fit beautifully together in a step-by-step process. And in the app, people can go to the app, obviously watch lots of free videos and audios and kind of get a feel for it. And then if they choose to go with the program, they get all of the videos and audios, and they get weekly sessions with me. So we hold people's hand as they go through the program through weekly sessions. And Kiki, the game changer has been daily Gupta size. So these are daily Zoom calls with our trained coaches. People don't even have to think about the program or try to understand it if they feel overwhelmed. They can just come onto our Zoom call, and our coaches take you through the nervous system regulation, take you through the brain retraining every day. And that has just accelerated people's healing because it gives consistency, motivation, but most importantly, a sense of community. Imagine you've got 200 to 300 people a day coming on a call with that joint intention to heal. And it's just so beautiful and powerful, and people have incredible breakthrough experiences. So that's been really the game changer. And we, until we get large scale phase 3 trials on our program, we even give a money back guarantee on it, just so that people feel comfortable and confident in moving forward with a step like this in terms of their investment.
It's amazing. And so you have an app, you have a website. So how can people find you?
So the first thing we'd love for people to do is, yes, watch some free videos and audios to get a feel as to whether this approach is right for them. Because if it's not, we don't want people to do the program. And so they can go to our website, which is guptaprogram.com, or they can go to the App Store or Play Store, download the free app, and start retraining their brain straight away, because we give away a lot of free stuff, including at the moment, just for the moment, the first part of free Gupta sites, the daily Zoom calls, so people can even start and find that really beneficial for free and never do anything else. So that's what I'd love for people to do, is really get a flavor and an experience and see if this is the right approach for them.
And what drives you, Ashok? Because you're incredibly driven to help people, I think. But, you have this wonderful fire, and you've been doing this for a long time, and you've been helping thousands and thousands of people. What is the biggest driver for you?
It's that moment. And I'll give you an example of this last week. One of our clients gave us this story that a few years ago, she got long COVID. And she had been from pillar to post, been through the entire medical profession, taken all the supplements under the sun, and was getting worse and worse. And to the point at which she becomes suicidal. And she had seriously considered taking her life. And as a last-ditch moment, she said, let me just try this thing called the Gupta Program that I've heard about. And within months, she got to 70% better, 80% better, and now she's hiking, she's completely well, and she's got her life back. And she said, Ashok, you saved my life. Had I not found your program, I wouldn't be here. And so the reason we do this work, and all of us, here at the Gupta Program are mission-driven, is because we see the amount of suffering that is going on this planet right now. Tens of millions of people have got long COVID, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, unexplained illnesses, autoimmune illnesses. There's such a wealth of suffering, and the quality of people's life is really like 10 or 20% of what it could be. And they're not being looked after by the mainstream medical profession, because the mainstream medical profession looks at hardware issues, but it isn't very good at treating software issues. So what drives us is, really that healing of suffering across the planet, getting people well, and hearing those types of stories. It keeps us 100% motivated across all of our teams in the Gupta program, and makes it the reason we do what we do.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Ashok. It was wonderful to have you on the MindHealth360 show. I love your program. I love the science behind it. I love the evidence behind it. And I love your passion. And, I'm a big believer in it, having helped me quite a lot. And I hope that more and more people will be aware of it and have it as a tool in their healing arsenal. But it's incredibly effective in my experience, and certainly your research bears that up. So thank you. Thank you for what you do. Thank you for being here, and keep up the great work.
Yes, thank you, Kiki. I really appreciate your lovely words. And I think it's something for, as you say, for all of us on the planet, not just if we're suffering from a condition, but also practitioners, functional, integrative, nutritionists. You all do incredible work in this particular field. And I would love, we're partnering with so many functional doctors right now. We'd love for them to also incorporate this piece to create that true vision of integrative healing. And then we can all work together to accelerate the healing of millions around the world.
Well, it's interesting because certainly in the functional medicine field, there's a lot of emphasis now on the nervous system and the overactive immune system, on psychoneuroimmunology, essentially. And the fact that the brain and the nervous system play such an important role in healing, and that you can do all the supplements and the lab tests that you want, but that you won't heal until there's a sense of safety, until there's a sense of nervous system regulation. And that actually the brain and the nervous system are absolutely key to healing. And I think there's a recognition of that, which has really grown over the last few years and continues to grow. So I think, it's a really important piece of work that you're doing. And I think it's really important that it gets out there into mainstream practice, essentially, as well as functional medicine practice, of course, but also into the mainstream. That would be wonderful. I think it's often the missing piece. And I think more and more practitioners are realizing that it's the missing piece, and realizing that they need the tools to really balance the nervous system, retrain the brain, and incorporate the psychological and safety aspects, which are absolutely essential to physical healing and mental healing.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Our dream is that in 5 to 10 years' time, when you go to your doctor with a neuroimmune condition or a pain condition or an inflammatory condition, actually there's a holistic program that is given to you that incorporates brain retraining right from day one, so that we don't wait until they've had it for years when it's embedded in the brain before they heal. And that's really our vision, is to bring this into primary care level.
And just, I think one more question is, this obviously we focus more on mental health in this podcast, and we've talked a little bit about mental health and neurological health, but other mental health conditions, whether it's ADHD or OCD or, bipolar or schizophrenia. I mean, do you see, obviously there's a huge role for this, but I mean, we talk a lot about the physical conditions, the complex chronic illness, but the psychiatric illnesses, have you seen a lot of great results in that area as well?
Yes, we want to see whether, certainly with anxiety, we know for anxiety, our program is highly effective for that. In terms of depression, obviously there's a more caution there, because it definitely needs support with a practitioner, although once again, we're seeing improvements in that. But two big areas where our clients are telling us, and this isn't us recommending it for that, they're just telling us, addictions and OCD. We're having massive improvements in those, which makes sense because those are essentially repetitive responses that are stored in the limbic system, and you're retraining those repetitive responses with more kind of cognitive approaches. And so we've had great results with that. And I think that there are so many potential research studies we could do on so many different conditions. Anorexia, as an example, eating disorders, we've had very good results with that. We've had people who've had anorexia for 20 years who've then been able to heal using this approach. So I'd love to do studies in that area. And really, it comes down to funding. So we have a 501c fund in the US, and we're looking for funds to support that so that we can then run multiple studies to look at the effects of this. Even psychedelics, could we combine psychedelics with this type of brain retraining approach instead of psychotherapy? Would we see even more accelerated results because it's really getting to the core of what potentially psychedelics do, which is loosen up the neuroplasticity of the brain and enable it to open up to new experiences and new ways of being? Could we, I dream of the day where we are actually able to do microdosing or psychedelics combined with our approach and heal people within hours or days from something because of the neuroplasticity.
Well, that absolutely makes sense because essentially, it's true that psychedelics work by, as you say, I love that, loosening the neuroplasticity of the brain so that, their new pathways can be established. So that's fascinating. Well, I must say we could go on for hours talking about this because it's so interesting and it's so important. And I really admire your passion and your intelligence and your vision because it's super important and it's amazing. So thank you, Ashok, very, very much.
Thank you so much, Kiki. It's been lots of fun and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much for listening to the MindHealth360 Show. I hope that we've helped you realize that mental health symptoms have root causes that can and need to be addressed in order to sustainably heal, and have given you some ideas about steps you, your loved ones, or clients may take to start their healing journey. Please share this interview with anyone you think may find it helpful, and don't forget to subscribe to keep up to date with our latest interviews on integrative mental health. If you want further information, please go to www.mindhealth360.com or find us on social media. This information is for educational purposes only and is not intended to diagnose or treat any disease or to replace medical advice. Please always consult your healthcare practitioner before discontinuing any medication or implementing any changes in your diet, lifestyle, or supplement program.